big hello to everybody tuning in virtually. Very excited to be here to present to you a topic that perhaps many of you don't know much about, and that is the wonderful world of chemical compliance. You'll notice I have this subtitled Vast and Complex, and that's for good reason, as we will see throughout these slides today. But before I move on, a little about Hologic. We design and manufacture women's healthcare products, both medical devices such as mammography, breast biopsy devices, as well as in vitro diagnostics such as STD tests, HIV tests, things like that. And I just wanted to quickly give a shout out to our diagnostics division for reacting quickly and developing and manufacturing a test for COVID-19. So today, Hologic is currently producing 1.5 million tests per week, which makes up nearly a third of all the COVID-19 tests in the US today. I am super proud of my company and what we're trying to accomplish to help us navigate this COVID-19 pandemic, something that affects us all and for which we are holding this conference virtually. I originally had planned on giving kind of a high-level overview of the world's most prominent chemical compliance regulations, but given as I only have 30 minutes, that was a little ambitious. So I decided to really just focus in on those major regulations in the European Union. So today we're really just going to do a deeper dive into EU ROJAs, REACH, the upcoming new SCIP database, and of course the MDR regulations with regards to the hazardous substances. My goal here today is really not only give you some education in this field, but perhaps a little appreciation for the amount of effort involved in maintaining and adhering to these regulations, but also provide you maybe with some practical application activities that you might be able to take back with you and help your company manage your own chemical compliance. So although I'm going to be just focusing kind of on the EU today, I just want to give you a sample. This is just a sample, keyword sample of the many global chemical regulations that are either in force or are being developed today. In yellow up here, you see kind of the many ones for the EU. And then we have, China, Turkey, Malaysia, South Korea, Serbia, Pakistan, and then, some in the US as well. Again, this is just a small snippet of what's actually going on in the world here. But again, I'm only going to be focusing on the EU today, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the consensus amongst industry is that many companies don't have a full grasp of the chemical compliance management, especially in the EU. A German Federal Institute study concluded that out of 3,800 registrations of substances, only 1/3 of them met the information requirements. And currently ECHA is developing a strategy to address that lack of information, which will most likely result in some type of more enforcement. Second, the regulation EU 2019-1020 got passed recently. It's on market surveillance and compliance of products. This actually brings together market surveillance, customs, and regulatory enforcement authorities from each member state together in a single data sharing environment to manage kind of a wide range of product laws. What this will do is it will enhance their ability to kind of focus on non-compliant articles being placed on the EU market. So another enforcement item there. And then also, as we've heard other people talk about the new EU MDR regulations coming May 26th of 2021, because hazardous substances are kind of written into that regulation, my suspicion is that we will see a lot more weight being put on chemical compliance and your ability to actually place your products onto the market. And I think the enforcement is just going to be coming soon. Kind of to sum all that up, if it's not a problem for you already, it most likely will be a problem for you in the future. So it would behoove you to get control of these regulations. So let's start off diving into what I consider the simpler of the regulation, the chemical regulations, and that's ROJAs, or the Restriction of Hazardous Substances. This directive has been around since 2006, and I'm guessing most of you are at least vaguely familiar with it. The spirit of the regulation is to reduce the environmental and health impact of electronics That's why it applies to electrical and electronic equipment, or EEE. That means kind of outside of scope would be things like manuals, packaging, non-EEE devices. So the regulation says no more than the maximum concentration value by weight in a homogeneous material, as specified below, shall be tolerated. Here we have our list of chemicals, materials, substances that were not allowed to be over 0.1% weight by weight, except for our friend cadmium here, which you can see is 0.01% weight by weight. So what this means is that if you are above this threshold, you are therefore non-compliant to ROJAs, and therefore you cannot affix your CE mark, and therefore you cannot ship the product into the EU. And it's very cut and dry. It's kind of no go, on off type of situation. I highlighted these last 4 chemicals because they are actually enforced for a lot of other non-medical device industry items right now, but specifically for medical devices, not coming into force until July 22nd of 2021, so we have a little bit more time before that comes into fruition there. I do have a link here, or a document here that's embedded that you can click on, and it's actually all the exemptions that you can maybe use to get out of having to do any type of ROJAs activity for some of your products. One thing I would caution though, if you do use an exemption, they do have sunset dates on them. That is something that you actively need to manage to make sure that you are not trying to use an exemption that no longer exists after a few years. So just leave that there for you to do as an exercise later. But now, that's really all I have to say about ROJAs, because like I said, it's really very cut and dry. If you are over the threshold, can't ship your product. So let's move on to something a little more complex. In fact, I'm going to state it's actually a lot more complex, and that is EU REACH. So REACH stands for the Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. So we talked before about ROJAs being kind of a go, no-go type of situation. I would think of REACH as more of an if-then. So less go, no-go, more if-then. So if I am over the threshold limit, then what do I have to do? What kind of obligations do I have to meet in order to be able to continue to ship my product to the EU? One of the first considerations that you need to have for any of your products or any of your objects that you're shipping over there is whether it's an article or a raw substance or mixture. These are governed differently. They have different requirements. And so it's really the first step that you need to know. You need to define what your product is and categorize it as one of these 2. There's really great guidance on that, and I've linked that here. The guidance on requirements for substances and articles, it's actually really well done, and it's got some flow charts that can walk you through whether your device is an article, raw substance. And it may seem trivial at first, and you might think, well, I know if my article or if my product is an article, if it's got a shape. But for instance, a wax crayon consists of paraffin wax and pigments and is used for coloring and drawing on paper. The paraffin wax functions as a vehicle or a carrier for the pigments. So therefore, its shape, surface design are not more relevant for the function of the crayon, which is to bring pigment to paper, and then its chemical composition. So therefore, it is to be regarded as a mixture, which may seem counterintuitive to what you previously thought. There are such things as combination articles and substances. For example, a printer cartridge has both article and a substance within it. And then there's also complex objects such as welded or epoxy pieces that may be of 2 different materials and have different substances in there. All that's in the guidance. I encourage you to read that. One thing to note here, all objects/substances are in scope of REACH, including packaging, labels, IFUs. Anything you're shipping to the EU has to be considered for what it's made of. And then one other note that you'll hear me state throughout this is the obligations to ECHA specifically are on the EU manufacturer, importer, or supplier. So that doesn't mean if you don't have a presence in the EU that you're off the hook, because perhaps you still sell into the EU and the importer might have the obligation to do the registration, but they're also going to need to know information from you. and you're going to get that from your supplier. So it's just going to work up the supply chain. Okay, so here's kind of the first tool that, that I think that maybe might be useful for you to take back if you're going to try to understand what substances in your article and what obligations you have to meet for REACH. Notice I highlighted articles up here because this is specific to articles. So if you've classified your medical device as an article, this is the checklist for you. So I'm going to actually walk through this, and I know I'm going kind of fast because, again, I only have a half an hour and I'd like to spend more time, but I can't. So quickly, the requirement here is that the substance is on the SVHC list and in an article over 0.1% weight by weight. The obligation would be you would have to communicate that information to your downstream customers, and there are no exemptions to get out of it. So what is an SVHC? That is a substance of very high concern. These are substances that are reviewed periodically by ECHA and have been identified as harmful. In fact, ECHA actually reviews this list every 6 months. This is something that is a high maintenance item and needs to constantly be reviewed, looked at, and you have to constantly go back to your suppliers and ask them if they're now still have any of these new items or new substances within their products. The other thing that I'd like to note is the word article. Once an article, always an article. So long ago are the days where you could take something that had over the threshold limit of an article in a very small, let's say a resistor, and then put it into something that was really heavy, and then average that weight over the entire product and say, oh, I no longer meet that standard now. Once an article, always an article means that if it was over the threshold limit within the resistor, it has to stay over that threshold limit within your whole product, and you still would have that obligation to communicate to downstream users. Second requirement, if the substance is on this SVHC list and in an article over 0.1% weight by weight, and you're importing greater than 1 ton of it per year into the EU per legal entity, then you have an obligation to notify ECHA that you're doing so. Now, there are a couple of exemptions here. REACH Article 7.3 says if the substance does not come into contact with humans or the environment, then you don't have to do your notification, or if the substance has already been registered for that use, you also don't have to do a notification. The second one would involve a little bit more homework. You'd have to actually go on the ECHA website, look up the thing, see what it has already been registered for, and then of course document that, that this exemption applies to you. Another requirement, if your substance is intended to be released from your article and you're importing greater than 1 ton per year into the EU per legal entity, you now have the obligation to register that substance with ECHA. There are exemptions, but they are substance and or use dependent. So again, more homework for you to have to actually look up all that information and then document and decide if you still have to register the device or if you can use an exemption. And lastly, these last two, they're really just other lists. So there's an authorization list and a restricted list. And if that substance is on either one of those lists, you have these obligations of authorization, getting authorization from ECHA to actually continue to use that substance, or it's completely restricted. You can't ship it in there, of course, unless you have an exemption. We all have a generic exemption. I'm going to make that blanket statement here because 9342 EEC is the medical device directive right now, and that's what everybody's using if you're selling it into Europe because the MDR isn't enforced yet. So right now, if you're under that, then you have the exemption to not have to do any authorization from ECHA, but only if the substances that are subject to the authorization are only there on the list because of hazards to human health. Sometimes if you look up the substance, it'll say hazards to human health, but then it'll also have like hazards to animals or hazards to the environment. If those are there, then you actually can't use this exemption anymore, which is a bummer. Okay, one other thing I'd like to mention, enforcement of this is by each member state. Although ECHA writes the regulations, reviews the regulations, manages the regulations, they're not an enforcement agency. So it's actually done by member state. And up here, just as a reminder, the EU manufacturer or importer has the obligations to ECHA. So let's walk through an example here quickly. We have, hypothetically, we have DEHP in housing of our medical device at 0.2% weight by weight. So let's actually use this as a checklist and kind of walk through the exercise here. Is the substance on the SVHC list and in an article over 0.1% weight by weight? Yes, it is. We checked, it's DEHP is on that list. It's in the article, it's at 0.2%. So therefore, and there's no exemptions, yes, it does apply to us. So we do have an obligation to communicate that information to downstream customers. Downstream customers are a specific definition within this guidance regulation, and it really applies to not direct consumers, but anybody else that's in the supply chain in Europe. So, sorry, in the EU. So if they're in the EU, they're buying from you, perhaps as a distributor, you have a communication to, or an obligation to communicate this information, that this substance is in your device to the downstream users. There's no prescription on what that could look like. So maybe some thoughts or some recommendations on that. Perhaps you could develop a memo that states this. You could put it on the labeling, add that memo to your BOM, and it goes out with every shipment. If you're shipping everything to one customer all the time, you maybe could just get away with sending them an email and letting them know that there's the substance in all the products that keeps getting shipped to them. But that would be your obligation. So let's look at the next one here. Is this substance on the SVHC list and in an article over 0.1% weight by weight? And are we importing 1 ton per year into the EU per legal entity? Well, let's pretend we are importing greater. We're selling 1 million of these devices, and that puts us over the 1 ton per year threshold of DEHP. Let's look at the exemptions here. The substance does not come into contact with humans or the environment. That's not true because it is housing. It's going to be something that people physically touch. So we can't use that one, but we can use the next one. Perhaps substance has already been registered for that use. If we look it up, do our homework, we can see that, DEHP is used as a lot of plasticizers in medical devices. Perhaps it's already been registered for that. So we can now say, no, we don't have this obligation to do a notification. So moving on, the substance is intended to be released from articles and importing greater than 1 ton to the EU. Well, our DEHP that's in the housing, not intended to be released from that housing. It's going to stay right where it is. Therefore, this one does not apply to us. Oops. Next, the substance is on the authorization list. Actually, it is. So under entry 4, it is there. However, we have this generic exemption from authorization that we can use specifically for DEHP. It does meet the only because of hazards to human health, so we can use this generic exemption. Therefore, this one doesn't apply. And the substance is on the restricted list. Actually, DEHP is on the restricted list. However, I was able to find an exemption under this conditions of restriction for DEHP. And that one says that basically this restriction shall not apply. Restriction of DEHP shall not apply to medical devices under the MDD. So that one also does not apply. Okay. This is the similar exercise for raw substances and mixtures. So you'll notice that we still have kind of the same obligations here on the side, but the actual requirements might be a little bit different, especially for this first one. So the first requirement, if we're manufacturing in or importing greater than 1 ton per year of any substance. Now remember, with articles, it was a substance that was on the SVHC list. This is any substance. Any substance that we're shipping into the EU greater than 1 ton needs to be considered for communication downstream users. Additionally, you must provide the recipient with an SDS in the official language if the substance is hazardous, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, or is included on that SVHC list. Now, there are some exemptions. Some substances that we know very well their chemical properties and their hazards that we can kind of exempt from this. So, I encourage you to look at those. Similarly, we have registration, authorization, restriction, those same obligations here. Those are any substance manufactured or imported greater than 1 ton per year, except for the exempt substances, if it's on the authorization list, if it's on the restricted list. Again, we can use some generic exemptions here. And then with restrictions, same thing, exemptions are substance and are use dependent. One thing that I do want to point out, a very subtle difference that maybe hasn't connected between ROJAs and REACH. So if you're familiar with ROJAs, but you're not as familiar with REACH, that's the kind of the idea of cumulative tonnages. So with ROJAs, it's very product specific. It's, here's my device. Is my device ROJAs compliant? If my device is ROJAs compliant, then it can ship to the EU. So yes, we do care about that with REACH, but then there's also cumulative tonnages. So if there's DEHP in the housing of this product, and then I have 100 more products with DEHP in their housing as well, and I'm selling 100,000 units of each of these into the EU, what is the cumulative amount of DEHP that I am shipping to the EU per year across all of my devices? And that's the calculation that they care about. So it's not necessarily per product, but cumulative tonnages. The next thing that I kind of wanted to share with you is let's actually go back a slide. The relationship between these three lists. So here we have the SVHC list, the authorization list, and the restricted list. We go over here, you can see that this kind of intended process is that there's a selection of chemicals or substances that are actually looked at, reviewed by ECHA. There's a public consultation period. And then up to 6 months of that. And then ECHA decides, well, is this something that we want to care about or something that really could cause harm? If so, then it should go on the SVHC list. And that's that candidate list, that second blue bullet there. So it'll stay on that candidate list as a substance of very high concern for approximately 1.5 years. What this does is it gives industry notification that says, hey, this is a substance that it's hazardous. It's something that you should be starting to remove from the product. So it gives you time to kind of respond to that. And then it'll actually move on and be put onto the authorization list, where you actually have to justify why you're still using it in your product, even though we've already told you that it's a substance of high concern. So, and get that authorization to continue to use it. And then once it stays on there for another 3.5 to 4.5 years, then it will actually go sunset date and become a substance that's listed on the restricted list. And that's when it's kind of a no-go. And that's when you're not supposed to be able to use it unless you have an exemption, of course. Now, this timeline up here was, I think, very ambitious and good in theory. We haven't seen this timeline hold up over the course of years or so, but that doesn't mean that they can't start enforcing it at any time. So just be aware that, once you're told and once a substance gets on that candidate list, that SVHC list, that your time is ticking and it's limited, and you really should develop a plan to remove any of those substances from your products. Okay, so let's talk about if you do have to register a substance with ECHA. Well, right now there's kind of two pathways. You can self-register, or you can contract with a REACH-only representative, somebody that has a presence in the EU that will represent you and do that registration yourself, much like an authorized rep. So if you choose to self-register, there's only one registration per substance in ECHA, which means that if you're the first one to register, you're now the lead registrant. You will foot the bill to do all the testing and to get all the information that they need to be able to fill in all the information there. And then as more people will join in and want to register their tonnages being imported into the EU, they will kind of you'll get reimbursed later. If you're not the lead registrant, then you will join a CEF, and you are then kind of paying back the lead registrant as you go there. You'll need to know your tonnage bands, 1 to 10, 10 to 100, things like that. Obviously, higher tonnages, more that you're shipping in there, there's going to be more analysis and documentation required. And you must be registered for the correct tonnage before import's allowed. So it really pays for you to keep really good tabs on your tonnages. So if you're getting close to that 1 ton limit, that would be a good indication that you need to probably register your product, because you're not going to be allowed to continue to ship if you're already shipping over that 1 ton limit. In order for you to actually do a self-registration, you do need an EU presence. You need to have either a site there, manufacturing site there, or again, that regional representative, because you can't get a REACH ID or access to IUCLID, which is where you need to fill out all that information, unless you have an EU presence. Contracting a REACH-only representative, it's not going to be a walk in the park. It's not like you just pay somebody money and they just do everything for you. They're going to still rely on you to gather a lot of the data and a lot of the information, and they'll just be able to hold the account and actually submit a lot of the data, and of course provide you some SME advice. One thing I do want to mention, supply chain matters. So if you are going to do a registration of any of your substances, it is important that you understand where that substance actually came from. And the reason is because you might be able to get out of registration. For instance, if that substance was manufactured in the EU already, then it was already incumbent upon that manufacturer to do the registration, account for that substance and that tonnage before it got shipped out to you, and then before you shipped it back into the EU. So you don't want to double count. It may be just as easy as obtaining that REACH registration number from the manufacturer and document that you are a downstream user or a re-importer, depending on your location. However, if it was manufactured outside of the EU and the manufacturer has not registered that substance, you will need to register it. Perhaps the manufacturer has already registered that substance as a courtesy to their customers. Some do. It just, sometimes brings in more business if you already have that registration. Then it depends on if they used an EU branch to make that registration or a REACH-only representative. Because if they use that EU branch, it's unlikely that you'll be able to piggyback or go under their registration, because all of your imports will have to go through that branch to make it into the EU. But if your manufacturer used an OR, then you would just kind of have to request if their registration can cover your tonnages that are being shipped in. If so, probably sign an NDA with them, pay them some money, and then you can obtain that REACH registration number and gain registration that way. This is very challenging. So I know I went through that really quickly, but it's a long process. Sometimes many distributors don't like to divulge manufacturer information because they're afraid they're going to be cut out of that supply chain. So it is really difficult to understand, but if you can map it out and really get it, you might save yourself some money and save yourself some registration headache. Last couple of slides that I have here really are just a quick talk about this new SCIP database. The European Union Waste Framework Directive was revised in 2018 to include mandatory requirements for a centralized database of these substances of very high concern. This new SCIP database is coming January 5th, 2021. That's right. In like 4+ months, this will be in force with this new SCIP database. And the requirement is to list in the SCIP database where SVHCs are present in your articles over 0.1% weight by weight with no import requirements. So if you send one device that has an SVHC in it over the 0.1 limit to the EU, you have an obligation to register that article within the SCIP database. This is just a sample. They're still actually developing it, much like, the MDR. They're kind of still developing this, but this date is still held firm right now, January 5th, 2021. Just be aware that that's coming up soon, and you're going to have an obligation to register there. Last couple slides are about the EU MDR, hazardous substances. I'm not going to read all this, but this is kind of copied directly from the regulations. One thing that I just wanted to point out is what's in blue here for links. Substances that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic to reproduction, known as CMRs, of category 1A or 1B. If you actually click that link, it will take you to a list of the CLP list, basically, that has thousands of these substances in there. If you did a filter for category 1A or 1B substances, you'd get about 800 substances. That means that you should be asking your suppliers if any of these 800 substances are in any components that you're purchasing from them. Similarly with endocrine disrupting properties, that's also another list. Now there's only 9 so far that have been conclusively identified as endocrine disrupting, but there's approximately 80 that are still in review. And of course more just keep being found all the time to be added to the list. If you do still have those CMRs or EDs in your product and you just can't get rid of them for various reasons, of course, this regulation right here, part of the EMDR, just says, you have to duly justify why you're still using them and give an argumentation as to, why you can't use something else and that it's going to be a problem for you and everything like that. So just like anything else we do, we have to justify it. So that was super quick, but I just wanted to give you a couple of takeaways. So if you kind of just blurred through all that stuff, some of the things that I just want you to understand is that this area is expanding. It's growing in complexity all the time. This is not a one and done requirement. I know a lot of people have maybe pretty good NPI process where you might do a set it and forget it and say, oh, we were reaching ROJAs compliant when we made the product, but now it's been 5 years. That's not the case. You can't do that. The regulations are changing. You have ECOs going on. You're changing parts out. It's something that has to be constantly monitored. You need considerable resources in this area to maintain this. It's, as you can see, we walk through. I mean, there's lots of considerations to be taken here. And another kind of warning, enforcement is coming. I can feel it. It's coming. We're gonna start to see more of it. So some questions that you should ask yourself as you go back to your day jobs. Do you have control over the substances in your device? Can you keep up with these changing chemical regulations? And can you easily incorporate new chemical regulations into that process that you've made? All right, thank you all for your attention. I know that was a lot, kind of drinking from a fire hose, but that's chemical compliance.
Thank you again, Renee, for your amazing presentation. And we do have a question from you from the audience, Renee. And the question is the manufacturer obligated to provide evidence by testing for what's in the product to show compliance to REACH?
No, so that's one way. You could do testing. You could do direct testing, destructive testing, things like that. You could send it to a lab and get them to actually test for all the things that are in your substance, or you can call your supplier and say, supplier, what's in this thing I bought from you? And have them give it to you. And that's a relationship that you really have to develop with the supplier and help them along sometimes if it's a mom and pop shop and they're maybe not sure exactly what you're talking about, but you're going to have to, handhold them through the process and say, these are the things I need from you. One other thing that I would say and strongly recommend is as you make your supplier agreements is to very clearly state what kind of deliverables you're expecting from that supplier to be inclusive of REACH declarations, ROJAs declarations, things like that, hazardous substance declarations, those types of things.
Wonderful. And yet that is Rene Hardee. And if anybody has any other questions for even after the virtual summit, do let myself and my team know and we'll connect you with her. Thank you so much, Renee.
Thank you.